You were taught that power has a face. You were taught that decisions have signatures. That when something catastrophic happens, when a market collapses, when a policy destroys a generation, when an institution quietly eliminates a class of people from economic participation, somewhere, in some room, a person raised their hand and said, "I authorize this." You were taught accountability is a feature of the system. It is not. It was never designed to be. Accountability is the decoy. It is the visible node in a network specifically engineered to have no visible nodes. And the moment you spend your energy trying to find the face behind the decision, you have already lost. Because the architecture was built precisely so that your search would exhaust itself before it reached anything real. This is not cynicism. This is geometry. Let us be precise about what is actually happening. In physics, there is a principle. Force does not require contact. Gravity does not touch you. It bends the space around you until your own motion carries you exactly where the field intends. You fall and you believe you are falling freely. You are not free. You are following a curvature that was shaped long before you arrived. The boardroom operates on the same principle. Direct action creates friction. Friction creates evidence. Evidence creates exposure. And exposure is the only threat the architect cannot neutralize with more capital. So the boardroom does not push. It does not pull. It bends the field. It restructures the incentive landscape so that the executor, the intermediary, the subcontractor, the algorithm, the agency, the elected proxy, moves in the intended direction under the complete illusion of autonomous choice. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination that can be traced. What you are looking at is something far more sophisticated. A system that produces the desired outcome through structural pressure rather than explicit instruction. The operator never receives a directive. The operator receives a context, a funding environment, a regulatory climate, a set of consequences attached to noncompliance that are never spoken aloud because they do not need to be. The message is encoded in the architecture itself. And here is what makes it elegant, what makes it almost mathematically beautiful in its brutality. Every layer of intermediary that stands between the architect and the action is not a weakness in the chain. It is load-bearing. Each proxy absorbs a quantum of accountability. Each subcontracted executor becomes a buffer of plausible deniability. By the time the action reaches the masses, by the time the policy lands, the enforcement occurs. The consequence is felt. The causal chain has been diffused across so many nodes that attribution becomes computationally intractable. You cannot prosecute a gradient. You cannot hold a field responsible for the path it made inevitable. And so the masses do what the system trained them to do. They find the lowest visible node, the middle manager, the enforcement agent, the algorithm, the face that was placed in front of the mechanism specifically to be found. They apply their outrage there. They exhaust their energy there. And the architect, several layers up the abstraction stack, remains not merely protected, but structurally invisible. Not hidden, invisible, there is a difference. Hidden implies concealment. A thing that is hidden can be found if you look hard enough. Invisible means the system itself does not register the architect as a variable. The architect is not in the equation you were given to solve. The architect wrote the equation. Now ask yourself the question you were never supposed to ask. If every action that carries reputational cost is always delegated exactly far enough down the chain to ensure the architect remains invisible, then What does that tell you about every institution you were taught to hold responsible? What does it tell you about every face you were shown? And if the proxy is always the one who absorbs the consequence, if the executor is structurally designed to be the terminal node of accountability, then what exactly is the relationship between the one who acts and the one who decides? Are they even the same kind of entity? Part 2 will answer that. But before it does, sit with this. You have never in your life witnessed the actual decision being made. You have only ever witnessed its execution, and you were trained to believe that execution and decision are the same event. They are not. They are separated by the most valuable distance in the architecture of power. The distance that makes one man visible and another man free. They are not the same kind of entity. The architect operates at a layer of abstraction so far above the execution surface that the two might as well exist in different dimensions of the same system. The executor lives in the world of consequences. The architect lives in the world of conditions. And the distance between those two worlds is not accidental, it is engineered. It is maintained with the same precision an aerospace engineer maintains the tolerances in a load-bearing joint, because if that distance collapses, if the architect and the action ever become traceable to the same coordinate, the entire structure fails. There are two principles that govern how this distance is preserved. Two laws, unwritten, never spoken in any boardroom because they do not need to be spoken. They are already encoded in the incentive architecture. They are already load-bearing in the design. The first is the principle of calibrated delegation. Every action carries a cost profile. Reputational cost, legal exposure, social friction. The architect does not avoid action. The architect calculates the cost profile of each action and delegates it precisely as far down the chain as required to ensure that cost profile never touches the origin node. Not further, not less, precisely as far as required. This is not laziness. This is not cowardice. This is optimization. Because overdelegation creates its own risk. Too many nodes in the chain means too many points of failure. Too many variables the architect cannot control. So the chain is kept as short as possible while still maintaining the critical buffer. The executor is placed at the exact distance that maximizes plausible deniability without sacrificing operational precision. You will notice, if you begin to look for it, that every institution that absorbs public outrage is positioned at exactly this distance. Not too close to the architect to implicate, not too far to be ineffective. The calibration is not approximate, it is surgical. The second principle is the principle of incentive encoding. The architect never issues a directive. A directive is a liability. A directive has a sender. A directive can be subpoenaed, leaked, traced. Instead, the architect encodes the desired behavior directly into the incentive structure of the executor's environment. Funding flows toward compliance. Regulatory pressure increases around noncompliance. Career trajectories bend in the direction of the intended outcome. The executor, operating rationally within this engineered landscape, arrives at the desired action through what appears to be, and genuinely feels like, independent judgment. This is the mechanism's most elegant feature. The executor is not lying when they say they made their own decision. They did. They made the only rational decision available within the field they were placed in. The coercion is invisible because it operates at the level of the environment, not the individual. You cannot compel someone who was never given a command. You cannot free someone who does not know the walls are there. Let us make this concrete. Let us run the scenario. A boardroom identifies an outcome it requires. The outcome is not illegal, but it is the kind of outcome that, if attributed directly to the boardroom, would generate the precise category of public attention that capital cannot neutralize. It would create a face for the force, and a face can be targeted. So the boardroom does not act. Instead, it adjusts the funding environment of a mid-tier operator, an institution positioned close enough to the execution surface to have operational reach, but far enough from the boardroom to appear independent. The adjustment is not a grant. It is not a contract. It is a shift in the conditions under which the operator's existing funding is renewed. A quiet recalibration of what outcomes the operator's continued solvency depends upon. The operator's leadership, rational actors, optimizing for institutional survival, reads the new landscape. They do not receive a phone call. They do not receive a memo. They receive a context. And within that context, a particular strategic direction becomes obviously correct. Funding flows toward it, resources reallocate, a new initiative is announced. It is announced in the operator's name, with the operator's branding, justified with the operator's stated mission. The initiative requires enforcement. The operator contracts an executor, a third-party agency, a subcontracted firm, an algorithmic system, to carry out the operational layer. The executor is given parameters, metrics, performance thresholds. The executor optimizes for those metrics, because that is what the contract rewards. The masses encounter the executor. They experience the consequence. They generate outrage. They investigate. They find the executor. They apply pressure. The executor points to the parameters set by the operator. The operator points to the funding conditions set by the market. The market has no face. The market is not a variable in the equation the masses were given to solve. The boardroom is not in the equation. The boardroom wrote the equation. And here is what the masses will never see. Because it is the thing the entire architecture is designed to prevent them from seeing. The boardroom did not want this outcome because it is cruel. Cruelty is not the point. The point is that this outcome serves a structural function. It preserves a condition, eliminates a friction, secures a position in the game, and the boardroom identified that function, calculated the cost profile, and delegated the execution to exactly the distance required. The executor did not know they were executing a boardroom objective. The operator did not know they were transmitting a boardroom signal. Everyone in the chain acted rationally, independently, within their own frame of reference. That is not a flaw in the system. That is the system working exactly as designed. Because a mechanism that requires its components to know what they are part of is a mechanism that can be disrupted. A mechanism that produces the desired output through the rational self-interest of components who have no idea they are components. That mechanism is close to unbreakable. Close to. Not entirely. Part 3 will show you the fracture lines. The places where the architecture is not as solid as it appears. The conditions under which the gradient becomes visible. But understand this before you get there. Seeing the fracture lines is not the same as knowing how to use them. And the architect knows where the fracture lines are too. The architect knows where the fracture lines are too. Sit with the weight of that sentence before you move past it, because it changes everything about how you approach what comes next. You are not the first person to see the geometry. You are not the first person to trace the chain backward from the executor to the operator, to the funding condition, to the invisible hand that recalibrated the environment. Others have stood where you are standing. Some of them were intelligent. Some of them were resourceful. Some of them had platforms, coalitions, momentum. And the architect was already waiting at the fracture line when they arrived. This is not a reason to stop. It is a reason to be precise. Because the fracture lines are real, the architecture is not perfect. No system built by entities optimizing for their own survival is ever perfect, because perfection requires omniscience. And even the boardroom operates with incomplete information. The gradient has gaps, the field has irregularities. And those irregularities are not random, they follow a pattern. And a pattern can be read. The first fracture line is latency. The mechanism that makes the boardroom invisible, the layered chain of delegation, is also the mechanism that slows it down. Every node in the chain introduces a processing delay. Every proxy that absorbs accountability also absorbs time. The architect can shape the field, but the architect cannot reshape it instantaneously. There is always a window between when the new conditions are encoded and when the executor has fully reoriented toward them. That window is small. It is rarely longer than a single operational cycle. But it is real, and inside that window, the chain is momentarily legible. The signal is still traveling. The nodes have not yet fully adjusted. The direction of pressure is visible before the pressure itself becomes invisible again. The second fracture line is over-optimization. The principle of calibrated delegation requires the architect to maintain precise control over chain length. But precision is expensive. It requires continuous monitoring, continuous recalibration, continuous investment of attention across multiple simultaneous chains. At scale, this becomes a resource allocation problem. And resource allocation problems produce trade-offs. The boardroom, managing dozens of concurrent delegated chains, will inevitably under-monitor the ones that appear stable. Stability is the signal that a chain has been deprioritized. A deprioritized chain is a chain with reduced architect attention. And a chain with reduced architect attention is a chain where the executor has more actual latitude than the system intends. Third, the fracture line of incentive drift. The principle of incentive encoding assumes the executor's incentive landscape remains stable. But incentive landscapes are not static, they evolve. The executor accumulates information, relationships, alternative funding sources, reputational capital that was not part of the original environmental calculation. Over time, the encoded incentive loses precision. The executor begins to have genuine options. And an executor with genuine options is no longer fully predictable. The architect's model of the executor was built on a version of the executor that no longer exists. These are not theoretical vulnerabilities, they are observable. But observing them requires a specific kind of attention, not the attention of outrage, which is reactive and therefore always late, but the attention of the system's analyst, which is anticipatory and therefore occasionally early. Outrage reads the consequence. The analyst reads the condition. Outrage asks, "What just happened?" The analyst asks, "What configuration of incentives made this outcome structurally inevitable? And what does the current configuration predict will happen next?" This is the shift. This is the only cognitive reorientation that matters. Because the boardroom's primary defense against observation is not secrecy. It is timing. By the time the consequence is visible, the causal chain has already been diffused. The outrage arrives after the evidence has been absorbed into the architecture. but if you are reading conditions rather than consequences, if you are watching the funding environment shift, watching the regulatory climate recalibrate, watching which operators are suddenly receiving attention and which are being quietly starved, you are reading the signal before it becomes noise. You are inside the latency window, and inside the latency window, the chain is briefly visible. The direction of force is legible. The executor has not yet moved. The outcome has not yet been produced. You are looking at the architecture in motion before it completes its work. This is the only position from which the system can be navigated rather than merely survived. Which brings us to what you actually do with this. Not how you fight it. Fighting a gradient is not a strategy. Fighting a gradient is what the gradient wants you to do. It wants your energy applied at the surface level, where it dissipates harmlessly. The question is not how you resist the architecture. The question is how you position yourself within it so that the architecture's motion carries you toward your objectives rather than away from them. 3 directives, no more, no less. First, before you analyze any institution, any policy, any decision that affects your position, map the funding conditions that institution depends on. Do not ask what the institution says it is doing. Ask what outcome its continued solvency requires it to produce. Follow the funding environment backward through the chain until you reach the node that cannot be traced further. That node is as close to the architect as you will get. Everything between that node and the consequence you experienced is load-bearing infrastructure. It is not where decisions are made, and it is not where your attention should live. The advantage is this. You stop being surprised by outcomes because you read the condition that made them inevitable before they arrived. Second, train your observation to operate inside the window between field recalibration and executor reorientation. This means watching for discontinuities, moments when an institution's behavior stops matching its stated incentive structure, when funding patterns shift without public announcement, when operators who were previously stable begin making decisions that only make sense if their environmental conditions have already changed. These discontinuities are the signal. They are brief. They require you to be watching before the event, not after. The advantage is this. You gain positional information that the masses will not have until the consequence has already been produced and the window has closed. Third, identify which executors in your operational environment are approaching genuine incentive drift. These are the nodes where the architect's model has become stale, where the executor has accumulated enough alternative capital, relational equity, or reputational independence that the encoded incentive no longer fully determines their behavior. These executors have latitude, latent, perhaps unrecognized latitude. An executor with unrecognized latitude is an executor who can be approached with a proposition that the architect's model did not account for. You are not subverting the chain. You are operating in the gap between the chain's design and its current reality. The advantage is this. You gain access to operational nodes that the boardroom believes are fully controlled, which means the boardroom's model of the field does not include you as a variable. You were given an equation to solve. You were told the equation contained all the relevant variables. It did not. The architect was not in the equation. The boardroom was not in the equation. The conditions that made every outcome inevitable were not in the equation. You were given a solvable version of an unsolvable problem, specifically designed to exhaust your capacity for analysis before you reached anything real. Now you have a different equation. It is harder. It requires you to watch conditions instead of consequences, to operate in windows instead of reactions, to think in chains instead of events. It requires a quality of attention that the system specifically trained you not to develop. But it is the actual equation, and the architect for the first time is in it. Subscribe to Axiom Protocol.